الرحمن الرحيم. أهلا ومرحبا بكم مرة أخرى في الحلقة الثانية من الجلسة الأولى، والتي تتناول موضوع التقاليد التاريخية للمخطوطات بالحرف العربي في إفريقيا. ويسعدني أن أرحب وأدعو الدكتورة ماريا لويزا روسو إلى إدارة هذه الحلقة من الجلسة الأولى. والدكتورة ماريا منسق ميداني لمشاريع مخطوطات مالي بجامعة هامبورغ بألمانيا، وهي حاصلة على درجة الدكتوراه، متخصصة في حفظ المواد المكتبية والأرشيفية وصيانتها، وتعمل في مالي مديراً ميدانياً تابعاً لمركز دراسة ثقافات المخطوطات التابع لجامعة هامبورغ، وممثلاً ميدانياً كذلك تابعاً لمتحف ومكتبة مخطوطات هيل بجامعة سين جون بمينيسوتا. درست روسو الصيانة والأرشفة وعلوم المكتبات، وعملت بكل هذه المجالات إلى جانب عملها في تنسيق مشروعات حماية مخطوطات مالي وحفظها منذ عام 2015. تتمتع ماريا بخبرة طويلة على المستويين الوطني في إيطاليا والدولي في حفظ مجموعات المخطوطات وصيانتها وإدارة بياناتها. تولت روسو مسؤولية وصف مجموعة المخطوطات الإسلامية في جامعة تورينو وصفاً كوديكولوجياً، ووضعت خطة حفظها، وشاركت خلال عامي 2008 و2009 في المشروع الدولي لحماية المخطوطات الموريتانية. شاركت روسو كذلك بمجموعة من المحاضرات والعروض التقديمية في عدد من الدورات الجامعية والمؤتمرات الدولية، ولها مقالات منشورة في مجلات وكتب وإصدارات أعمال لمؤتمرات وطنية ودولية. أهلا وسهلا بالدكتورة ماريا روسو، وأترك لها الآن المجال للبدء بالحلقة الثانية من الجلسة الأولى التي تتحدث عن التقاليد التاريخية للمخطوطات بالحرف العربي في إفريقيا. فلتتفضل.
Thank you, Dr. Muehlhaeusler, for this introduction. I will, and also thank you for inviting me in, for moderating this session. The panel focuses on the historical Arabic script manuscripts, cultures, and tradition in Africa, and this specifically this second session, which I'm going to moderate, will address manuscripts traditions in East and North Africa. The session will host 4 speakers. We will have a keynote speech and 3 presentations. I would like to move immediately to our speakers, of course, after having welcomed everyone to this session. And please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Professor Katrine Bank, who is a professor of history at the Department of Archaeology, History, Cultural Studies, and Religion at the University of Bergen in Norway. Professor Bank's research interest is in the Islamic history of the Western Indian Ocean in the 19th and 20th centuries, including Yemen, Oman, Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. Her work has mainly focused on various forms of religious change, but also social, legal, and political change. Her work has been mainly based on Arabic sources combined with field work. Professor Bank has also conducted projects for the digitization and conservation of manuscripts, which are in private ownership and in danger of environmental degradation, such as the project for the manuscript collection at the Riyadh Mosque College in Lamu, Kenya, which is one of the oldest continuously functioning Islamic teaching institutions in East Africa. The title of her presentation is The East African Islamic Arabic Manuscript Tradition. Please, Professor Bank.
Thank you so much. Let me just share the screen first. Let's see. I think now you see it and you also hear me. Can you indicate, Marie-Louise? Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Maria-Louise Russo, for this kind invitation, and thank you to the director, Metat Isa, and the organizers for bringing us all together in this very important conference, despite the apparently never-ending pandemic. I'm really honored to be able to speak here today, and I want to direct a little special thank you to Dalia and the team for setting us up in these Zoom room solutions and keeping us updated. And I do say that with some regret, because it would of course have been much, much nicer to meet you all in person in the beautiful library in Alexandria. But to today's talk, what I will try to do today is to give a tentative overview of the historic Islamic Arabic manuscript tradition of Eastern Africa. That is the region also known as the Swahili world. This region today encompasses the nation states of Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, the northern part, the Comoro Islands, and parts of northern Madagascar. However, in the interest of time, I will try to limit myself to speak about collections in Kenya and Tanzania. But please keep in mind that also northern Mozambique and especially the Comoro Islands have a strong tradition of authoring and copying Arabic Islamic manuscripts. The same is true for some regions of Madagascar, although the latter are better known for its Surabe writing. So, in the 20 minutes at my disposal, I will try to do two things. I will share some of the findings based on my own and others' recent research and try to draw some comparisons to traditions both within and beyond Africa. And then secondly, try to indicate some avenues for future research. Now, my own background is that of a historian of the Islamic world and particularly of the Indian Ocean regions. So I tend to highlight human agency, such as the circulation of texts, their usages, and the formation of Islamic thought. It means that some of you may miss a stronger focus on the object itself, such as its paleography and codicology. This is by no means to say that these competencies are not very much needed in the study of East African Islamic manuscripts. I just state here that this is not really my specialty. I will also point out here that I will speak exclusively on the Arabic language texts. Although several of the collections that I'll touch upon also hold items in Swahili Ajami. Now, the first and most notable observation about the existing corpus of the East African manuscripts is that it's very recent. The humid East African climate is simply not very kind to paper. In fact, the vast majority of the items in known collections are like this. They are 20th century, so-called small books, copied with pencil or with ink pen in various types of notebooks. This period also overlaps clearly with the era of Busaidi Omani rule on the East African coast from the mid-19th century through the British period, which in turn corresponds to the very gradual introduction of print in the region. The same period also prompted an increased emphasis on Arabic text production overall in the courts, in administration, and in teaching institutions. So that means that the transition to a fully fledged print culture was in fact extremely gradual, whereas the degradation of older manuscripts was rapid, meaning that the age of Arabic language manuscripts on the Swahili coast, it lies approximately between 1850 to 1940, 1940s, although there are, of course, outliers like the ones shown here. The manuscript to the left is held in the Riyadh Mosque in Lamu and bears the date 1162, Hijra, corresponding to 1748. Also, I would add the image clearly goes to show the shortcomings of digitalization, because watermarks and other features that could determine the age is inaccessible to us here now. Reportedly, there is a manuscript dating from the 17th century in the Zanzibar National Archives, but this has not been available to research. The one on the right is the most recent I have seen. It is a copy of the Maulid Miraj, written in a notebook in 1957. Of course, this is not to say that manuscript production did not take place well before 1850 or even after the 1950s. It simply means that environmental degradation, perhaps also combined with political upheavals, like, for example, the Zanzibar Revolution of 1964, has left us with few traces. Here, as this panel and this conference is aware of, the situation differs very much from the one in West Africa, like Timbuktu and the other scholarly centers in the region. A distinctive feature of the East African Arabic corpus is that it's very much part of what we may term an Indian Ocean network of text production, closely connected to South Arabia, but also to the subcontinent and to Southeast Asia. The agents here were authors, translators, copyists, owners, buyers, sellers, and gradually also printers. In total, this constituted a textual network, both in terms of actual traveling texts, objects and texts, but also in the form of allusions, intertextual references, tropes, and imagery. This is what Ronit Ritchie investigated in her 2011 book, and which she called an Arabic cosmos. The same area is what other scholars have termed a Shafi-Sunni ecumeny. This was based in a common set of Islamic texts, the Quran and the Hadith collections, of course, but also Islamic law, theology, Sufism, and devotional texts. Last but not least, this being overwhelmingly a region where Arabic is not the vernacular, this ecumeny was also based in a vast literature on the Arabic language itself. Another contrast to West Africa is the limited corpus, or to be more precise, the limited known corpus. The collection in the Zanzibar Institute for Archives and Records is one of the major collections in the region, but its manuscript holdings are still relatively limited. The best hand list to date by Lorenzo de Clich gives about 170 manuscripts. Also important is the collection of the National Museums of Kenya, and another source in turn is the more limited and less explored collections of the National Research Center in Moroni in the Comoro Islands. Some individual or small collections of manuscripts are held in libraries in Europe and the USA, notably Paris, London, and Yale University, but these two are in fact very limited. There are also some digital collections available, but again, the scale is nowhere near that of the West African corpus. Some more are underway as we speak, including also Swahili Ajami collections. I will introduce here briefly two such collections which I have worked with myself. These are the collections of the Riyadh Mosque, which was founded around 1900 or slightly before, and the Malam Idris collection in Zanzibar. These are in fact very different collections. The first is a distinct institutional collection, thus very much influenced by the teaching curricula of the Riyadh. It is the only institutional collection that was listed in the 1993 World Survey of Islamic Manuscripts by the Furqan Foundation. And by that time, it was stated to be the largest known collection in Kenya. Even so, the digital version, which makes up the entire known manuscript collection, consists of merely 145 items. The Malam Idris collection, on the other hand, is the result of one man's collection over many years. This collection is dominated by printed books from the early print era, but also holds around 30 manuscripts. Again, the majority dating from the 20th century. In terms of content, all collections bear some traits that are quite striking and which mirrors the content in corresponding collections in Indonesia and Malaysia. That is particularly the high prevalence of texts that in one way or another are meant to be performed, or spoken or recited. That goes for devotional texts, Sufi litanies, texts that may be classified as medicinal or magic. Not surprisingly, language-related disciplines also occur frequently in a society where Arabic is not the spoken language. The two next categories are genealogy and law. The prevalence of genealogy is also not unexpected in a society strongly marked by migration and where authority at times was attached to specific ancestral line. Islamic law, on the other hand, marks East Africa as part of the aforementioned Shafi-Sunni Indian Ocean ecumeny. So in the interest of time, I will not go into each category, just simply point out some examples. Some of the devotional texts are connected to the specific practices of the three dominant Sufi orders, or historically dominant Sufi orders in East Africa, the Qadiriyya, the Alawiyya, and the Shadiliyya. However, many are also texts that are common or generic throughout the Islamic world, like the ones you see here, the Mawlid Barzanji and the supplication known as the Dua Asma Ahl al-Badr. . I will also pause at language-related disciplines, just to show you my absolute favorite manuscript, the Swahili Arabic Dictionary, made by the Brawanese Zanzibari scholar Abdulaziz Al-Amawi in the late 1800s. To the right, you see another locally authored Arabic instruction manual by yet another Brawanese Zanzibari, Muhyiddin al-Qahtani. It shows the emphasis placed on the Arabic language and the various ways in which scholars tried to produce material for teaching Arabic. Of course, they also relied heavily on classical manuals like Ibn Malik's Alfiya and its commentaries, of which you find numerous copies. Turning now to what these manuscripts tell us about manuscript production, circulation, and usage, I will just briefly present you with some findings. This is an overview of the named local copyists in the Riyadh collection. The names of these copyists show that by the early 20th century, literacy and copying skills had reached well beyond the boundaries of the founding family of the mosque. The names marked in red show names that clearly indicate an origin outside of the Hadrami Ba'alawi. Of course, in East Africa as elsewhere, the objects themselves tell us about owners, buyers, sellers, and endowers of manuscripts, which is a rich source of social and intellectual history. Just an example here, I will highlight this manuscript from, until now at least, uncatalogued collection in the Siu Mosque in Pate in Kenya. The Waqfiyya here says that Muana Barka al-Sumali made this book Waqf at an unspecified date, as if we need another indication that manuscripts were highly valued objects, and that those who were in a position to do so would and could make them Waqf. And of course, the interesting fact that women also did this. Finally, and this is a point which I find particularly interesting, is the long overlap between manuscript and print production in East Africa. You find several manuscripts like this one, produced in 1927, which looks very print-like, with table of contents in the back, the scribe sometimes signing off as Nashir, as publisher, which indicates not only changing styles, but this is also important in the study of the manuscript to print transition and the wide range of material and intellectual Islamic modernities. Let me hurry quickly to the last part of this talk, where I would just try to raise some research themes that these manuscripts can play a role in. I have alluded frequently to the protracted manuscript to print overlap. The question that follows is how this impacted transmission and if adaptations of practice followed. We may also start asking how these adaptations took place. If we look at textual transmission, especially of smaller Arabic texts like prayer booklets, maulids, etc., we may find that these adaptations took place not in manuscript or print, but in changes to the oral or audiocentric teaching of the same texts, and variations over reading silently, like tala, or reading communally, like qara. Furthermore, only a limited scholarship exists on the ways in which written text may have been perpetuated differently, for example, by men and women, between the generations, between social groups, and between locations. Here, I think there is a rich field both for trans-African and trans-oceanic comparison, as many of these texts are equally widely circulated and practiced in West Africa and in Southeast Asia. Last one, of course, there is the study of the manuscripts themselves and their materiality. Here, as we know, much remains to be done, and conferences such as the one we have now will hopefully bring about new initiatives for the collection, for the conservation and cataloging of new Islamic African manuscript collections. I just want to add here that it's important to take into account not only that this is a textual corpus that is at times contested, it is also alive, it's being performed. These collections as a whole are testimony to the Eastern African style of collection, conservation, teaching, and knowledge transmission. However, they're also lived and practiced today. So regional grounding and participation is vital, both for research and for heritage practitioners. I'm looking forward to new collaborations and partnerships that may not only produce new research, continued conservation, and regional and trans-regional collaboration, but also continued usage in local contexts. And by that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bang, for your speech and for such an interesting insight into East African manuscript tradition and to the transition between manuscript and print. Thank you. I will now hand over to our second speaker, Professor Carl Davila, Associate Professor of History at the College of Brockport, State University of New York. His research has dealt with the various aspects of the textual history of the Moroccan Andalusian Nuba tradition, including the publication of 2 books and several articles on the subject. Most recently, Professor Davila has turned his attention to manuscript traditions behind the Andalusian music anthologies, looking at them as both material and social objects. Professor Davila's presentation is entitled Many Musical Manuscripts, Art, Craft, and Materiality in Early Modern Morocco. So please, Professor Davila, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Russo, and thank you very much to the organizers of this amazing conference. It's a rather gray and rainy afternoon here in Western New York, so I rather miss the weather there in Cairo. Anyway, yeah, many musical manuscripts, music, value, and materiality in early modern Morocco. The Andalusian music of Morocco, known colloquially as instrumental music, el ala, is a poetic musical tradition which is held by its performers and aficionados to have originated in the Islamic period in Iberia. Oops, why am I not moving here? There we go. Originated in Iberia, Al-Andalus. And it's thus regarded with a great deal of respect as a valued cultural and historical legacy. The tradition has inherited a rich and detailed musical theory from the Islamic period in Iberia, and the lyrics of the songs feature poetry, often composed in fairly sophisticated language, often laced with medieval Arabic idioms. The monarchy has for centuries patronized El Ala and its performers, and today one hears the music on radio and television broadcasts in Morocco, particularly during holidays such as the Eid festival and Throne Day and so on. So this highbrow musical art bears a great deal of social prestige and represents high cultural values in the context of Arab Moroccan culture. So it's even become a kind of a national classical music in the Moroccan context. We find today more than 30 handwritten manuscripts have survived, spanning some 2.5 centuries, providing a rich historical documentation of El Ala's evolving repertoire. This presentation focuses on this array of handwritten manuscripts as evidence of the literary culture that surrounded the music. El Ala certainly has been a literary phenomenon at least since the creation of the earliest surviving written manuscript, Iqad al-Shumu'a li Ladhat al-Masmu'a bi Naghamat al-Tabu'a by Muhammad al-Muassami, who died sometime after 1738. But the whole reason for these manuscripts is the performed tradition itself, of which they are a partial and, one must say, imperfect representation. So the oral song as it is sung is primary over the written one, and this is an important fact to keep in mind when studying these manuscripts. The manuscripts today present the written text as poetry and do not capture all that was performed without the repetitions and line breaks and breaks between words, and also a pervasive use of nonsense syllables such as ha-na-na and ya-la-la and so on. So it's impossible really to reproduce the song as it is sung rather without hearing the song first. You cannot sing the song from the document. Rather, they serve as aide de memoire for performers and aficionados, and also serve social symbolic purposes by representing the musical tradition as highly respected literature, that is, poetry. The importance of this symbolic function of the literary tradition can't be overstated because it exerts a major influence upon the characteristics of the manuscript tradition we'll be looking at in this presentation. We should be looking at some of the 30-odd manuscripts of Al-Ala as social artifacts, objects used for particular purposes and bearing social meaning or value. We may organize them according to their uses and define a continuum that can be inferred from the materials used, the style and quality of the hand. On one end, we find documents that probably were used as reference works by musicians or ensemble leaders. They're not very carefully rendered. They make use of poorer quality materials, less elaborate color schemes, and may often use shorthand references to songs rather than supplying the full text of the song. On the other end of the spectrum, we find a number of manuscripts from throughout the history that clearly were created as shelf objects. That is, they were intended for the reading pleasure of their owners as well as for display of their owners' erudition and sense of traditionalism and so on. And in between, we find a number of manuscripts that show evidence of serving as mnemonic tools for performers while retaining and embodying some of the nicer features in common with the works intended for reading and display. I'm going to present some of the examples of the characteristic manuscripts from across the spectrum. And the goal here is that I'm going to argue that a thriving literary manuscript culture surrounded this musical tradition in Morocco in the early modern period. Aficionados and experts in the tradition made extensive use of documents that they regarded as having significant social cultural value by virtue of their connection to this erudite poetic musical tradition. Indeed, even the arrival of mass-produced print anthologies in the first half of the 20th century did not wholly extinguish this literary manuscript culture. It continues in a different form in the 21st century. Nowadays, a number of manuscripts of all types are to be found in public archives and on display as museum pieces in various places in Morocco, regarded as heirlooms and evidence of the music's high cultural associations. So we might say that the social life of these manuscripts continues. So, social value and materiality. Let's look first at some of the more utilitarian, useful manuscripts, as it were. As I've just noted, these manuscripts are characterized by the use of medium quality materials, often on printed block paper or in accounting books, a general looseness of the rendering of the text, and significantly, none of these documents has an elaborate muqaddimah at the beginning. At most, the opening pages may have a simple table of contents, or in one or two cases, a very brief summary of the modal system. Most, however, merely begin with the first song text. Even so, some copyists did use colored inks to indicate the beginnings of songs, even when the hand itself is rather careless. And of course, all of these manuscripts are held at major libraries or in public institutions throughout Morocco, such as the Bibliothèque Nationale du Royaume du Maroc in Rabat. So even here, the social value of the performed tradition has influenced the rendering of the text to some degree and shaped the social afterlives of otherwise relatively unremarkable manuscripts. So figure 1, manuscript number 858 Jim from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Rabat. This is an undated manuscript. The colors here are a bit of a guess because the original PDF that I received from them was very poor quality, but I think I've pretty closely caught the color scheme of the document. Notice the rather loose but readable hand, very minimal use of colors beyond the typical brown-black pigment. So there's some red and blue to mark the beginnings of songs. Sometimes the gaps in the line are marked with color markers and so on. And there are page numbers added. The red numbers on the right-hand column give the number of times through the rhythmic cycle for each line. So this is an indication that this document was created for use by a musician rather than to be kept as a prized possession in someone's library. There's copious marginal notes. The marginalia are copied in the same hand as the main text block. So this probably was copied from an older manuscript. And they indicate, among other things, the poetic meter of the song, where that applies, but also other songs in the same format, madhan, that is, in praise of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. And so this is further evidence that this was a practical document rather than one intended for display. And it was copied onto modern laid paper, showing that it almost certainly dates to the 19th century. Document number 2 is an unnumbered manuscript at the Dar el-Ala Museum in Casablanca. It's a later example, probably dating to the early 20th century. It was copied into an accounting book, and it's on display at Dar el-Ala. The usefulness of the accounting book format is obvious here because it provides pre-printed lines and well-defined margins for aligning the hemistitches of the poetry. Moreover, the cursory style of the hand and the absence of colors other than black further emphasize its very informal nature of this document. Its primary function surely was as a mnemonic tool for a musician or aficionado rather than as a marker of erudite social status. Figure 3 shows 2 pages from 2 different documents. On the left, document 7072 from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and on the right, number 7074 from the same library. This reveals other interesting aspects of these informal manuscripts, as well as evidence for the industry, if you like, that lay behind the production of these documents. 2 similar copies of an early manuscript of an early collection, Muehlhaeusler. 7072 on the left is dated to 1928. 7074 is undated, but the hands are so similar that it's clear they were copied by the same person. Unfortunately, the PDFs from the Bibliothèque Nationale are in black and white, but the descriptions that accompany the documents indicate that there were indeed red and blue markers associated with the beginnings of songs. Both were copied onto block paper. You can see the lines of the paper printed on here. And you can also see that the document on the left uses shorthand. On the 5th line down, it tells you that the song Muehlhaeusler also appears on page 169, just one little note. And then the last line shows you that on page 129, you'd find a copy of Talahi Ya Aini. So shorthand rather than the whole text. Taken together, these characteristics indicate 2 documents of the more utilitarian kind. But more interestingly, the fact that they were copied by the same person suggests that even relatively workmanlike documents like this one might have been commissioned by a musician or an aficionado from a commercial copyist, with no necessary connection to the tradition itself. This almost certainly was the case with the more ornate manuscripts, but this is one of the few cases where I can identify this process in action for one of the more, for some of the more utilitarian manuscripts. Figure number 4, manuscript number 4437, Dal, from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Rabat, shows some signs of being a more informal copy, but also indications that some care was taken to make the document attractive. Like the anonymous manuscript in figure 2, it was copied into an accounting book, but the Muehlhaeusler hand is much more controlled, much more readable, much nicer. Unlike 858 Jim, there are no marginalia and no musical notations, and we find a more elaborate use of hands and colors, alternating red and green for song and section markers with their vocalizations, and use of a bold Maghribi thuluth hand in the middle of the page to indicate the end of a section with fully vocalized text and so on. So this manuscript lies somewhere in the middle of our spectrum of uses. The paper and general appearance are not remarkable, yet the person who copied it clearly intended it to embody the social value of the tradition to some degree by using somewhat more elaborate color scheme, and especially by using a fancier hand to mark the ends of sections in the document. Finally, another similar example from the Universiteitsbibliotheek in Leiden in the Netherlands. In this case, we find red song markers, musical indications in red on the right-hand column, copious marginalia, and yet section markers with an elaborate Maghribi thuluth hand. Again, a utilitarian manuscript with some effort at making it pretty to look at as well. On the other end, we find the display or shelf manuscripts. Whereas the utilitarian manuscripts typically have been copied onto medium quality commercial paper and make more limited use of colors and so on, the finer manuscripts are produced on better quality paper. They make more elaborate use of colors and hands, and the finer, and they often indicate transitions between nubas, between sections in a Maghribi thuluth Maghribi thuluth script, and the hand is generally much more tightly rendered, much more readable. So working chronologically, let's begin with one of the finest examples, manuscript number 144 at the Khizana Dawoodiya in Tetuan. So here we find one of the early spreads in this document. The colophon of this document dates it to 1202 of the Hijra, that's 1788. And it's been copied onto old laid paper, so that sort of tends to support the date as well. Most of the Muqaddimah has been lost, but this shows one of the very first spreads, folios 4 verso and 5 recto, which contains the tail end of the Muqaddimah in a very elaborate color scheme: brown, black, red, blue, green, even gilt, and the use of the ornate thuluth hand. The poem on the right-hand page is part of an elaborate discussion of the musical theory within the tradition, and the diagram on the facing page is the so-called Shajarat al-Tubu', showing musical relationships between various melodic modes. Here is another page from this document, a typical page. Note that the text, which in a very nice Maghribi mabsut hand, is set in a colored frame with blue and red song markers, very ornate indication of the beginning of a section, red and blue highlights, and no musical indications are to be found. Occasional marginalia are only emendations to the text made by the copyist. So clearly this document was intended as a library piece, a book for the reading pleasure of its owner and for demonstrating the owner's commitment to traditionalism and so on. Unfortunately, there are few documents that survive from this tradition dated to the 19th century. This is especially true of the finer shelf examples, which perhaps not surprising, Morocco went through quite a bit of upheavals in the early 19th century, which probably put a damper on this sort of thing and perhaps even led to the destruction of some of these documents. In short, we'll never know what the musical manuscript culture of that era really looked like. However, between 1885 and 1930, we find a flowering of these manuscripts. In addition to the utilitarian examples we've already seen, quite a number of documents survive, which were copied into very nice wove paper, often with watermarks or distributors' dry stamps. Some were more ornate than others, but like the Dawoodiya manuscript I just showed you from a century earlier, most of them avoid marginal notes, make liberal use of color in text and highlights, often surround the text box with a colored frame, and use very nice mujawhar and mabsut hands, and often with a thuluth used for section markers. So these, not surprisingly, are the ones that are most likely to be held in private libraries or put on display in museums and so on. So figure 7 is a somewhat unusual example. You see it's written in a very nice hand, nice use of color and so forth. There are markers between the hemistitches of the lines, but it doesn't have a text box frame as do most of these other examples. You can see in the lower left a distributor's dry stamp, which suggests that this very nice wove paper was a broadly circulated commercial property or commercial material. Here we have figure number 8, manuscript number 38G from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Rabat. You can see many characteristics in common with the Wadia manuscript. Beautifully rendered hand, multiple colors, red, blue, and green, and the text frame, a box around the text, the main body of the text, and no marginal notes. A similar example from the British Library, 13235. Again, similar hand, use of a Maghrebi thuluth hand as a section marker, text box frame, and so on. And again, all of these have been rendered on very nice wove paper. And finally, one of the more elaborate examples, this is a document that was donated to the Dar el Ala Museum in Casablanca by the Benani family. And you can see here a very nice use of color, very nice use of different kinds of hands. The text box frame is really nicely rendered, and even indications of decorations on the section markers, little red and blue lines stepping out, really indicating that this is we're entering a new section of the document. So it's really a very nice, very, very nice example of this sort of shelf work. So El Ala, the Andalusian music of Morocco, is and has always been socially marked as erudite and traditional in the context of Arab Moroccan society. And this shaped the manuscript traditions that lie in the background of the performed text. Even some relatively informal workmanlike copies of the major anthologies reflect this in the materials and executions. And in turn, they lend some of their social value then to their owners, marking them as owners of cultural capital. To judge from the number of manuscripts surviving, especially from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it appears that the copying of manuscripts relating to El Ala formed a small but vibrant part of the marketplace in old cities like Fez, Tetuan, Meknes, and Rabat. It is clear then that by the early 20th century, copyists had access to a range of paper types to suit the customer's needs. Aficionados and musicians could choose more durable workmanlike materials, such as accounting books, which could be transported easily to rehearsals and so on, without risking the worth of the document itself. And they could expect the copyist to make some effort to produce an attractive, socially valuable work. Or they could choose finer paper, more elaborate use of colors, text box frames, ornate hands, and so on, which would result in a beautiful object that could be displayed as evidence of the owner's erudition and highbrow taste. Nevertheless, a great deal of work remains to be done to uncover details about the companies, for example, that produced and sold these later dry stamp wove papers, and more, which would reveal some about the relationship between the commercial and the social contexts surrounding this manuscript culture. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Davila, for this excursion into the world of musical manuscripts. Very interesting. The next speaker on the panel that I would like to introduce is Dr. Mark Muehlhaeusler, Director of the Center of Excellence for the Middle East and Arab Cultures at the American University in Cairo Libraries. He oversees the Middle East collections and directs several digital projects at the university. An Arabist by training in Oxford and Leiden, he has been working with Islamic manuscripts for many years. Mr. Muehlhaeusler has published research on Arabic papyri, early printing in Egypt, and Quranic manuscripts. His main interest is in the genesis and transformation of texts over time. The title of his presentation is Reading Marks in Kufic Manuscripts and Modern Printed Qur'ans from North Africa. Please.
Right, thank you so much, Dr. Russo, for the introduction. While I share my screen, please bear with me. I trust you can all see now.
Yes, we can see it.
Good. So thank you again, Dr. Russo. Thank you. Thanks also to the organizers of this conference for bringing us together, and in particular to Dalia for her tireless efforts to make everything work so beautifully. I really appreciate the opportunity that I've been given here. So, as was mentioned in the introduction, I come from the background of librarianship, and perhaps I should preface my presentation with a bit of disclaimer. I come to this from the point of view of a librarian, so I'm of course interested in publishing, trends in publishing, and particular ways in which publishing reflect intellectual interest, but also in a way in which publishing shapes interests and intellectual trends. I also come to this presentation from the point of view of the papyrologist, the codicologist, and so I hope that this presentation will not be too technical. I'm trying to make it as accessible as I possibly can. So this paper really expands on an article which I published a while ago in the Journal of Islamic Studies on additional reading marks in Kufic manuscripts. And in that paper, I discussed a series of what I call reading marks that are found in manuscripts of the 10th and 9th century of the Common Era. And my aim back then was to document existing orthographic features and also to examine how those features had been treated in contemporary Arabic sources. By contemporary, I mean contemporary to the manuscripts themselves. And today I'd like to add a few notes about orthography, in particular one orthographic feature, and to draw attention to the survival of some of those features in modern printed editions, in particular an edition of the Qur'an from Nigeria. That will then lead me also to think a little bit about the role and significance of local traditions in the face of a globalized printing and distribution practice. So what are we going to do? We're going to talk about reading marks, what I mean by that. I hope to go real quick through that, then take a look at reading marks in the Arabic tradition, provide some examples, talk briefly about Arabic sources of modern scholarship, and then come to the meat of this presentation, which is continuities in the modern era. So first of all, what are reading marks? For the purpose of this presentation, I define reading marks as all markings in the text, all orthographic signs other than the rasm of the Mus'haf. Other than the base text of the Quran. So in other words, I include points on letters to distinguish dal from dal, for example, or sin from shin, vowel markings like fatha, damma, kasra, as well as the long vowels not represented in the base text like dagger, aleph, and these things. I also mean things like hamza and shadda, recitation marks like things that indicate features of pronunciation like idgham and imala and so on and so forth, and stops. So all these are reading marks in my mind, and it's probably important to point out that reading marks is not a technical term, it's not intended to be one, but it's just a convenient label for me to refer to all these things in one go. And indeed, there is no accepted Arabic equivalent for the term reading marks. That said, and to start off with something that you may be familiar with, when the committee for the Egyptian Standard Edition, or also called the King Fuad edition, set out to produce their edition of the Quran, they appended a section at the end of the work called Istalahat al-Zabt, in which they listed systematically all these signs which they had been using in order to indicate things other than the vocalization. Although these features were firmly based in tradition, the inclusion of the systematic treatment at the end of the Mus'haf was really an important departure in the history of the printing of the Quran. The thoroughness and the precision of the King Fuad edition may have been a decisive factor that led to its adoption as the standard text for decades to come. And indeed, most or many of the people that are attending today will be familiar with editions of the Quran that reproduce this King Fuad edition exactly, even though it may not be marked as such. So, as I noted, many of these features are grounded in tradition. So let's take a look at something that you may not be familiar with. Indeed, very few other than the specialists will be familiar with this type of writing. And even those who are may have difficulty reading those texts fluently, so alien to the letter shapes seem to us today. What is more, these manuscripts are devoid of many of the devices that help us read fluently, like namely dots on letters or vowel marks. And indeed, the role of dots and dashes appears to be reversed. As you can see here, the red dots do not actually distinguish letters, but they do serve to indicate vowels, whereas the dashes, which are not present in this particular folio in Kufic manuscripts, would indicate distinctions between letters. So on the very first alif on the top right here, that would be a fatha. Allah na'buda. So you can see that the red dot in front of the beh indicates a dhamma, whereas the red dot on top of the dal in the middle of the folio indicates fatha. So this use of red dots to indicate vowels actually goes back quite a long time. It can first be observed in some of the Hijazi Ma'il codices, some of the very earliest surviving manuscripts of the Quran. These manuscripts are usually dated to the early 2nd to 8th centuries. And interesting and important to note that at the same time, the dots were actually already used in papyri, but they were not used just to indicate vowels, but they were used to distinguish letters. So very much the usage we have today. So there was obviously a dichotomy in the way in which dots were used. There's a very detailed study by Capelloni on that topic. Also, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem uses dots on top of letters to distinguish signs. So very, very different from the Quranic usage. Despite what was going on in epigraphy and in papyri, the dots were used systematically in Kufic manuscripts of the 9th and 10th centuries, and a broad selection of examples of that can be found in the Digital Library of Cambridge University, and there is a link that I can share with the presentation later on. It may be important to note that I'm using Kufic rather loosely to encompass a whole bag of scripts, and I refer people to the treatment of scripts in general by de Roche in his 1992 work on Abbasid codices. Now, as I mentioned earlier, my presentation, or my paper that I published back in 2016 expanded on a couple of articles by Yassine Dutton, which he published in 1992, 1999, and 2000 respectively, in which he studied color-coded dots, and they're both listed here as a second and third item. And Dutton back then observed that while one could identify certain tendencies in the use of color-coded dots, there was no uniform practice in the use of colors for particular purposes. He also pointed out, but on a side note, that certain modern printed Qur'ans from Nigeria still made use of colored dots. And that brings us to consider the use of colored dots across time and space. I just presented the example of the Al-Majur Quran from Damascus, which we saw earlier, was at Damascus, so it's in the eastern part of the Islamic world. However, the practice of using colored dots was also extended to the Islamic Maghrib. Just to provide an example from the Islamic West, this is the so-called Palermo Quran, which makes use of colored dots, which hails from Sicily. It was produced in 982 or 372 of the Hijra. And it's significant this codex can be located in time and space, because many of the codices, this is not possible. As a source, it's also important because this particular codex is very close in time and space to Abu Amr Uthman Sa'id al-Dani, who is an Andalusian author and who's our main source of information about scribal practices and writing the Quran through his various works on the matter. And these are really the main sources that we have. It's the Kitab al-Naqb al-Shakl, Kitab al-Muqna fi Masahif al-Amsar, and the Kitab al-Muhkam fi Naqd al-Masahif. These are main sources of knowledge for how Quranic manuscripts were written at a particular time. So Adani describes in minute detail the practice of nuqat al-baladina, hadithan or qadiman, with a critical eye to deviant or confusing practices. For example, he takes a very dim view on the common practice of adding variant readings to the manuscript codices, since it may confuse the reader. But in general, Dani provides a very succinct and remarkably accurate account of what he finds in the manuscript. And evidently, his work is an abstraction, so no single manuscript will contain all the features that Dani describes. But it was the purpose of my paper to show that in general, he's quite accurate. So that said, there are some codices that display a very comprehensive set of reading marks, and this is one of them. This was an item that was offered for sale at Sotheby's a few years ago. And this particular example contains a very elaborate scheme of reading marks to indicate shadda, which you can see here. I don't know whether you can perceive my cursor, but the shadda is this half circle mark on some of the letters. The sukun, which is basically a horizontal line in red. Idgham with runna up here on the very top right. And Hamza. So for our purpose, it's important to observe that the scheme used for Hamza al-Qat'a and Hamza al-Wasl, these are marked by yellow and blue dots, respectively. So you can see here, for example, inna, anna, and so on and so forth. And Allah with Hamza al-Wasl above. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But like most of the codices of this period, it's the provenance and the dating of this codex remain uncertain, but tentatively this example is described as North Africa or Near East, 10th century of the Common Era. And this brings us to the continuities, what we really want to be talking about. So this is the focal point of the presentation today, namely how this ancient tradition survives into modern practice that is still alive in Africa and elsewhere. So it's evident that the use of Kufic manuscript was abandoned in favor of the script style. So Kufic went out of fashion very quickly as Naskhi rose in the East and Maghribi script styles emerged in the West. And in the course of this transition, the elaborate system of reading marks was partly abandoned. And I say partly because some features of the orthography survived in the transition. In some Quran manuscripts, one can observe the notation of Hamza with color-coded dots, mostly as yellow in green ink. So I've got this example here, which is a Moroccan Quran, where again, we can observe the notation of Hamza with a yellow dot and a red line above. Now, the use of color has not survived in Egypt, or indeed in most parts of the Islamic world, where the overwhelming majority of printed editions of the Quran are monochrome in black and white, and also based on the reading of Hafs and Asim. But there are some exceptions, though. In Morocco, where the influence of the Maliki school endures, the reading of Warsh and Nafi' is still in widespread use. And Moroccan editions of the Quran, which use the characteristic Maghribi script, are common. So these editions still include salient orthographic features that pertain to the reading of Warsh. Like in this example that I show here, it's the Marf Taqlil and the Duha as a black dot, which is to distinguish it from the other readers that have Imala or Fathi in the particular same situation. So there are other stunning local traditions too, though, that I deserve attention. That's what I'd like to draw attention to in the example today. It's a Quran that I picked up by chance at a second-hand bookseller in Cairo. It's a copy reproduced from a handwritten text that was commissioned or produced by a person called Maher Sharif Belal-Kanawi al-Qadiri, and it was printed in 2007. Now, I have unfortunately not been able to locate a full biography of this person. On social media, I came across a post with this image in it, where the person was described as a foremost khattat among the scribes in Kano. That is all information that I have found. If any of the attendees have any further information, I'd be very grateful if you could share it with me. But the Nisba Kanawi, of course, indicates that this is a person that would hail from Kano. Yet this copy was produced in Cairo by Rabat in 2007 with permission from the responsible office Al-Azhar. But it represents a tradition that goes back to the local tradition of Kano, and its appearance is strikingly different from the monochrome text that many of us may be familiar with. So while the text is written in black, the rasm, the surah headings are in red, vowel marks are in red and yellow, while Hamza are written in green and yellow. And as it is in a marking of Hamza in particular, one can observe a direct continuity from the practice of the Kufic manuscripts. Going back to what I showed earlier, in the 9th century, there were two systems for marking Hamza al-Wasl. Either by a red dot, like in the Amajul Quran that I showed first, or a far more complex notation of Hamza al-Wasl, by which the Hamza was marked by a dot at the very tip of the alif and supplemented by a short red stroke, which is placed in accordance with the quality of the preceding vowel, which protrudes from the vertical parts of alif. I'm going to show an example close up in a moment. So the stroke is placed at the top of alif just beneath the dot. You can see this fairly clearly here, where we have a green dot here for the Hamza with kasra. We also have this here at Surat al-Alaq. The green dot indicates the Hamza al-Wasl. Because the preceding quality is of Dhamma, the stroke is here in the middle of the alif. So this is a very archaic feature, and it goes directly back to what Adani describes in his work in the 10th century, where he writes, وَأَهْلَ النَّقْتِ يُسَمُّونَ هَذِهِ الْجَرَّ صِلَةً وإنما أهل بلدنا قديما وحديثا جرة كالجرة التي هي علامة السكون. So there's a direct relation between the sukun and the jarra of the wasl, and this is exactly what's being described here. So we can observe this continuity, and the orthographic tradition by which this feature has been handed down is probably very difficult to reconstruct and establish over the centuries. But it is very clear that scribes in Kano preserved this unique feature, and a very ancient feature of Islamic heritage over centuries, and a heritage that has died out without a trace in other parts of the Islamic world. And in my mind, there are a few takeaways from that. On the one hand, the traditions, local traditions, including African traditions of writing the Quran, are far more varied than one might expect. Indeed, if you're looking from the vantage point of the Mashriq, like Egypt, we all expect that the Qurans look like the ones that we have in Egypt, but obviously that's not the case. There are traditions that are far more varied and far more complex. Another takeaway is that local traditions are important because they may preserve very important historical and archaic features. And then lastly, a thought about the publication process. Dissemination of mass-produced print editions of Quran is not necessarily a positive development. In recent years, we have seen the establishment of very large printing complexes for producing the Quran. These Qurans are distributed very effectively all over the world. But they're produced in a particular local setting, and I think there's a certain threat that these mass-produced products may threaten or may reduce the local traditions, and I think that would be a rather rather big loss for us, for scholarship indeed. That's it for now. And if you have any questions, here's my email as well. And I look forward to the discussion later on. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Muehlhaeusler, for such an insightful contribution, which deals also with yet another aspect of the sometimes complicated relation between manuscripts and printed books. So thank you. We move now to our fourth and last but not least presentation, which I am sure is going to be equally inspiring. The presentation is by Dr. Wadia Agounine, a research professor at the Learning and Development Center for Studies, Research and Revival of Sahara Heritage at Al-Muhammadiyah Association of Scholars in Rabat, Morocco, and a member of the Laboratory of Religious Studies and Cognitive and Social Sciences at the Faculty of Arts and Human Sciences in Fez. He led a number of symposia organized by the Learning and Development Center and participated in several forums, including the International Forum of African Cultures and the International Symposium, Sahara in Moroccan African Relations. Agounine authored and co-authored several publications on the subject. The title of his presentation is Berber Manuscripts and Arabic Script in Southern Morocco, Identification or Creativity. Please, Dr. Agounine.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. شكرا لكم جميعا. أود في البداية أن أتقدم بالشكر الجزيل وأعرب عن سعادتي لمشاركتي في هذا المؤتمر العلمي الدولي حول المخطوطات بالحرف العربي في إفريقيا. أتقدم بالمناسبة بخالص الشكر إلى كل المساهمين والعاملين على إنجاح المؤتمر، خاصة مكتبة الإسكندرية، هيئة المخطوطات الإسلامية، مركز المخطوطات بالمكتبة، وجمعية المكنز الإسلامي. شكرا للأستاذة داليا، شكرا للأستاذ مدحت، وشكرا كذلك للأستاذة ماريا المسيرة على هذا الجهد المبذول لإنجاح هذا اللقاء العلمي. كلمتي ستكون حول المخطوط الأمازيغي في جنوب المغرب وسوس تحديدا. سأحاول خلال هذه الدقائق المعدودة إطلاع المتابع الكريم على حضور المخطوط الأمازيغي في هذا المجال الجغرافي وأنواع المعارف التي حملها وتداولها المؤلفون فيه، وسأتطرق إلى ذكر أمثلة من المعاجم والمؤلفات المترجمة من وإلى الأمازيغية، وكلها بالحرف العربي. كما سأقدم نماذج من رسم بعض الحروف المستعملة للدلالة على النطق الأمازيغي لها. اسمحوا لي أن أعرض عليكم واجهة العرض. الحديث عن المخطوط الأمازيغي المكتوب بالحرف العربي يطرح جملة من القضايا الثقافية والعلمية والتاريخية والجغرافية، والتي ما تزال موضوع أبحاث ودراسات جادة للوصول إلى نتائج تنمي الرصيد العلمي والثقافي للأمازيغية باعتبارها هوية تاريخية لمجموعات بشرية مهمة في هذه المناطق. ومن ثم يبرز المخطوط الأمازيغي لا وعاء حاملا للثقافة فحسب، بل دالا عليها ومشكلا لها في نفس الآن. وهذا أمر يؤكده تنوع الموضوعات التي تناولها المخطوط الأمازيغي وصنوف المعارف التي ألف فيها أصحابها طوال قرون عديدة. فمن هذه المجالات والموضوعات التاريخ والرحلة، السيرة، الأسطورة، المناقب، الفقه، النوازل، منظومات في التوحيد والعقيدة والوعظ والوصايا، الأدعية، الأوراد، علوم الفلك والتوقيت والتنجيم والأجفار، علوم الفلاحة، التربة والنبات والكيمياء والصنائع، وعلم الحيل كذلك أو الميكانيكا، والطب، وفنون من المنظومات والأشعار والأهازيج والقصائد والمقطوعات وشوارد الأبيات في الحكم وقواعد الرسم الإملائي في القرآن. كان التأليف في هذه المنطقة، منطقة سوس، بالحرف العربي، والذي يعد جسرهم إلى المعارف والعلوم. هنا خطاطة عبارة عن مجموعة من العلوم التي ألف فيها الأمازيغ بالحرف العربي. كما ذكرت ألفوا في الطب والتصوف والعقيدة والفقه الإسلامي، وألفوا في النحو وفي البلاغة والقصص وغيرها من الفنون. وهنا بعض المصنفات وبعض المخطوطات التي خصصت الكلمة لها، والتي تتعلق بالمعاجم والقواميس. مما وقفنا عليه مجموعة من المعاجم هنا: معجم الأسماء أو تفسير الألفاظ العربية بالشلحة، والشلحة هي اللسان الأمازيغي في هذه المنطقة. هناك أيضا المعجم العربي الأمازيغي لعبد الله بن مبارك بن الجنان. هناك معجم الهلالي وهو معجم عربي أمازيغي. هناك الصورة للسعادة بالحسنى وزيادة أو معجم المارتيني، وهو معجم عربي أمازيغي قد حقق من طرف بعض الأساتذة المشكورة. هناك أيضا منظومة لغة الشلوح، وهي عبارة عن قصيدة لتفسير الكلمات العربية بالأمازيغية. هناك أيضا المجموع اللائق على مشكل الوثائق لعمر بن عبيد الله النفيسي، وهو في علم الوثائق، لكنه عبارة عن نظم عربي أمازيغي. هناك مؤلفات أخرى في تفسير العربية بالشلحة عديدة، ذكر بعضها العلامة المختار السوسي وهو مؤرخ في الجنوب المغربي. هناك أيضا معجم المفردات الطبية بالأمازيغية وما يقابلها، وهو معجم عربي أمازيغي. نسخ هذا الكتاب أو نسخة من هذا الكتاب نسخت سنة 1162 للهجرة. أما بالنسبة للتراجم، يعني الكتب المترجمة من العربية إلى الأمازيغية، نجد كثيرا من النصوص العربية المنتشرة في هذا المجال قد ترجمت إلى هذا اللسان الأمازيغي السوسي. على سبيل المثال متن الأجرومية في علم النحو العربي ترجمت إلى الأمازيغية على شكل منظومة تعليمية. وكذلك الترجمة الأمازيغية للبردة، والبردة هي من القصائد التي لاقت انتشارا واسعا في العالم العربي والإسلامي، وهي للإمام البصيري المصري، ترجمت إلى البردة، ترجمت إلى اللغة الأمازيغية، وهي بعنوان تلقيح الصدور بما يورث السرور. هناك تأليف أيضا للفقيه إبراهيم بن محمد الماسي بالشلحة ثم بالعربية. هناك مترجم المقنع إلى الشلحة، وهو كتاب في علم الفلك. المقنع كتاب في علم الفلك. ترجمت أيضا قصة فتح إفريقيا بنظم شلحي كذلك، إلى غيرها من المؤلفات. فيظهر من خلال ما سبق أن الأمثلة التي وقفنا عليها سواء تعلق الأمر بالمعاجم والقواميس أو بترجمة التأليف من العربية إلى الأمازيغية أو العكس، أن هناك هدفان يغلبان على إنتاج المخطوط الأمازيغي المكتوب بالحرف العربي، يمكن تحديدهما في الهدف التعليمي والهدف التوثيقي المعرفي. الهدف التعليمي يظهر كثيرا في مجموعة من التأليف المخطوطة التي تسعى إلى تقريب المادة العلمية العربية من المتلقي الأمازيغي ومحاولة تعليمه مبادئ الدين أو مبادئ العلوم الشرعية والقرآنية الضرورية. ونرى بالتالي أن المخطوطات باعتبار هذا الغرض لا تظهر كثيرا من الاهتمام بالجانب الإبداعي في التأليف، فهي عبارة عن تآليف تفسيرية للمعاني في حدود الاستعمال الشائع في ذلك الوقت والقطر. أما بالنسبة للهدف التوثيقي المعرفي فيتجلى في المخطوطات التي تسعى أو يسعى أصحابها إلى ترجمة معاني العلوم المختلفة إلى اللسان الأمازيغي، بما تتطلب هذه الترجمة من ملكات الفهم العالي والدقيق للعلوم المترجمة، وحتى يتم توثيق الذاكرة العلمية بمختلف معارفها وفنونها. فعلى سبيل المثال تتطلب ترجمة المقنع في علم الفلك إلى اللسان الأمازيغي معرفة تامة بمضمون هذا العلم وأسسه، كما يستدعي تمكنا في نقل هذه المعرفة إلى اللغة الأمازيغية، وهو جانب مهم من محاولة الإبداع في تعاطي العلوم مع الحفاظ على الوعاء الأصلي الذي هو الحرف العربي. وقل مثل هذا في ترجمة قصيدة البردة التي تعتبر إبداعا شعريا رائعا للشاعر البوصيري المصري. هذا نموذج لصفحة من ترجمة البردة والمسمى تلقيح الصدور بما يورث السرور. وتلاحظون أن المترجم يسوق البيت الشعري العربي ثم يضيفه بترجمته باللسان الأمازيغي السوسي. فهنا مثلا: من تذكر جيران بذي سلم مزجت دمعا جرى من مقلة بدم، ينقلها بالترجمة إلى الأمازيغية. وهنا أيضا نموذج من كتاب يشرح من كتاب التنجيم بالاعتماد على كتاب المقنع، وهو للحسن بن عبد الله بن أبي بكر، وتاريخ تأليفه حوالي 1779، فهو في علم التنجيم. أنتقل معكم إلى نقطة أخيرة تتعلق بالحرف العربي في المخطوط الأمازيغي. اختصارا، يحترم الأمازيغ في الجنوب المغربي بحكم تلقيهم لمبادئ اللغة العربية منذ التعليم الأولي في المدارس العلمية العتيقة الحرف العربي، فلذلك كانت كل المخطوطات المتوفرة لدينا في هذا المجال مكتوبة بهذا الحرف. لكن ما يميز الحرف العربي في مخطوطات سوس هو وجود جملة من الحروف ولو أنها قليلة يتم التصرف فيها على شكل معين ليؤدي نطقا معلوما. ومن أمثلة ذلك مثل حرف الزاي. فحرف الزاي مثلا يرد في كثير من المخطوطات في حالة نطقه مفخما على شكل ضاد ب3 نقط فوقها أو أسفلها، كما هو الحال في كلمة تظليت التي تعني الصلاة في الأمازيغية، أو كلمة نزرة والتي تعني رأينا. وأمامكم مثال لمخطوطين يرد فيهما هذا الحرف. فمثلا هنا حرف الزاي ورد هكذا بحرف الصاد فوقه 3 نقط في هذه الكلمة، وهي ظليت بمعنى الصلاة. ومعنى البيت كاملا: أفد ظليت في شفيع المحشر ثم الصلاة على الرسول، يعني شفيع المحشر. بالنسبة للكلمة الثانية في السورة أسفله، أشكو نزرة، في هذه الكلمة حرف الزاي ورد هكذا بالصاد تحته 3 نقط، يعني هنا 3 نقط فوق الزاي، أما في النموذج الثاني فهناك 3 نقط تحت حرف الصاد. أشكو نزراقيقا، فقد رأينا كثيرا ممن يرغب في ترجمة هذا الكتاب ويقصد الحكم العطائية لابن عطاء الله السكندري وهو مصري، فيدل هذا أيضا على التواصل بين هذه المناطق، بين مصر مثلا وبين بقية مناطق الجنوب المغربي. هنا أيضا حرف الكاف المعقودة، لأن في النطق السوسي ينطق حرف الجاء كثيرا في اللسان السوسي، فيأتي هذا الحرف في الرسم على شكل كاف فوقها فتحة أو 3 نقط فوق أو تحت الحرف. مثال ذلك مثلا في كلمة أيجا ويغبيس كما في صور المخطوط التالية. هنا مثلا أيجا، الجاف في 3 نقط في أسفل الحرف، وهنا في النموذج الثاني يغبيس 3 نقط فوق الكاف. والمخطوط الأول في علم التصوف وتربية النفس، أما بالنسبة للنموذج الثاني فهو عبارة عن قصيدة في مدح الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم. فالحاصل باختصار شديد أن المخطوطات بالحرف العربي في جنوب المغرب، سوس تحديدا، تناولت مختلف الفنون والعلوم المتداولة في تلك الحقب التاريخية في هذه المنطقة، ويعتبر الاعتماد على الحرف العربي القاسم المشترك في كل هذا الإنتاج المتنوع، رغم اختلاف أهداف التصنيف وأغراضه بين ما هو تعليمي وبين ما هو توثيقي معرفي. تبقى مساحة الإبداع موجودة في بعض الإنتاجات الشعرية التي تمزج اللغة العربية بالأمازيغية، أو المؤلفات في بعض الفنون كالفلك والمنطق التي توسلت بالترجمة إلى الأمازيغية في تقديم نصوص مبدعة تستحق الدراسة. شكرا على متابعتكم.
Thank you, Dr. Agounine, for your presentation. I think we can now move to our panel discussion. I will read the questions that came in from our participants. The first question is for Professor Bergen. It's interesting to see the beating of bandiri drum in East African masjid celebration. This is a familiar scene in the Nigerian Qadiriya Sufi tradition, often believed to have been copied from Baghdad from the early 20th century by Nigerian Qadiriya acolytes. Any evidence of the influence?
I think I'm not really in a position to answer that. The use of drums is, of course, I mean, it's usually portrayed as something that even predates Islam for ritual purposes. So I'm sorry to say that it's a bit beyond my competence, but it's certainly equally used among the different Sufi orders, the Qadiriya, the Alawiya, the Shadiliya, and as is pointed out here, also, of course, in West Africa. So I think it's an interesting topic for further research. I think it's the standard answer when you don't know the answer.
But there is the following question is for you as well. The colleague asks, focusing on East Africa, I wonder why the region of the Horn has been skipped out. We collected recently, and I would say surprisingly, a quiet number of manuscripts in Arabic or Ajami, in Somali or mix, produced in the coastal Somali peninsula, that then cross-bordered in the past, owned at some point in the coastal area of Somaliland, and then at some point in Zanzibar, to now come back magically in Somaliland. information mostly found on the manuscript notes in interlines or colophons. This is rather a comment than a question. So there is no actual question on this, but if you have any further comment on it, it would be welcome.
I saw that question, and I think it's extremely interesting what you have found. I certainly hope that we can be in touch, because we are at the moment starting a project that aims to do a proper archival mapping, if you like, or manuscript and print mapping. And I apologize for leaving out the Horn of Africa. It is not really my expertise, but I was kind of assuming that there would be a presentation on the Horn itself. Of course, there are already many digital online collections, or they exist also from the Horn. So, and the interconnections between, especially the northern part of the East African coast and Brawa, Mogadishu, coastal Somaliland has been strong and close. So it is surprising, the finding that you that you write, or that's in your question. On the other hand, it's not so surprising. So this is just an encouragement to absolutely get in touch, so we can include the reference also in the mapping that we are proposing to do now.
Thank you. Then we have a question for Dr. Davila. The participant asks, a question based on your studies on Alala manuscripts. He asks, what are the most important political and social issues they highlighted in this period of Moroccan history?
Well, these are manuscripts of a very old Asil sort of tradition. So they don't really reflect political developments or social developments directly in their contents. Having said that, they certainly suggest that whatever musical elements arrived in North Africa from Al-Andalus, probably toward the latter part of the 15th century, this tradition made a transition in its audience from a very erudite, upper class elite sort of tradition into the common people, really, probably beginning as a marker of identity for Andalusi migrant communities in cities like Fez and Tanja and so on. So somewhere along the line, this tradition moved out of the elite classes and into more or less the common folk who are educated and so forth. But they don't really reflect political developments or social developments directly. It's more of an inference. Again, as I pointed out, a lot of this sort of happens off stage, off screen, because we see it in the absence of manuscripts, of a lot of manuscripts from the 19th century, although there surely must have been people who were enjoying this music and so forth. We don't have many examples. And that's really a sort of a product of other developments that aren't really mentioned in the manuscripts. So.
Thank you. Then have another question, more practical for Professor Bang. The participant asked for an update about the publication of the East African volume in the Arabic Literature of Africa series. So how soon can the Africanist expect it, and whether it will contain Swahili or Ajami stuff?
Oh, that's a challenge.
People looking forward to.
Thank you for that challenge. Now would be the time to make a very firm commitment and say yes. It will be. Now, what is for those who know where it left off? It was intended to include both Arabic, Swahili Ajami, and Swahili modern text, or that would be mostly, of course, printed text. That has grown into becoming a completely insurmountable task. What what is in the works is an edition on the Arabic, which we will now hopefully complete under the current project, whereas the Swahili, Ajami and Swahili will be a volume of its own. The deadline, the current deadline is 2024, if that is of any usefulness.
This is always a bit inconvenient question from participants, because.
But thank you very much for the question, and now I'll put it out there, so it's even more binding deadline.
So you had to take a public commitment to it now.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. We have two questions for Dr. Davila. The first one is, how is Al-Ala musical tradition different from the Gharnati music in terms of their respective social status and representation in manuscripts?
An excellent question. It's actually somewhat more complicated than it appears at first glance. To my knowledge, there is no documentation of I've lost track of my frame here. Gharnati. Yeah, Al-Ala is far better documented in its earliest stages and through the 19th and 20th centuries than Gharnati is. Really, it appears that, and there's really not been a lot of manuscript study done of the two. But I would say that they're very similar in their social positions. The manuscript tradition in Al-Ala is rich with many examples. I do not believe there are many examples of the Gharnati tradition, because the Gharnati tradition is part of a larger collection of musical Andalusi style musics in Algeria. There are actually 3 different regional styles, and they all seem to rely upon the same manuscript or the same textual repertoire, and the differences appear to be mostly stylistic. And in that regard, there's very little documentation before the end of the 19th century of Gharnati. One important, I think, significant difference in terms of social status and so forth is that Gharnati and the other Algerian styles of Andalusian music did not receive the same level of influence or support from the government as Al-Ala has. As I pointed out in my presentation, Al-Ala has for some centuries really been patronized by the monarchy as a sort of national classical music. But as I understand it from the scholarship, really Gharnati and the other Algerian traditions have largely been a matter of cafes and private performances among upper class people through most of that same time period. And only very recently has the Algerian government, for example, begun exerting any kind of influence on preservation or teaching and that sort of thing. Whereas going all the way back into the protectorate and before in Morocco, you see the establishment of conservatories run by the government, low-cost classes for people who pay a few dirhams and can take a course and that sort of thing. So I think the social position has been much broader in Morocco than in Algeria, based on the scholarship that's been done to date, and I think much less influence in Algeria from the government and from the sort of institutional support in contrast to Morocco.
Thank you. And the other question always for you is about the Piro manuscript. Colleague saw a word Yanjijizu in blue ink in the left margin, and he asks what language is it and what does it mean? What does it indicate here?
That's Yanjisu. This is an error on the part of the owner of the manuscript, who added this note in ballpoint pen in the margins of the document. It's meant to be as an emendation by the owner of the manuscript, and it's an error.
Okay. Thank you. Then we have a couple of comments for Dr. Muehlhaeusler. There are participants who are willing to exchange with you about the topic you addressed in your presentation. So I would rather share these comments with you after the session, if you agree.
Yes, one of them actually very kindly sent a link and I followed it. I'm very, very grateful for any help. Thank you.
Yeah, they're very kind. They also provide email contacts, so really it's
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, then we have a question for Dr. Agounine. The participant asks, in Sub-Saharan Ajami manuscripts, have specific marks for non-Arabic sounds, for instance, the 3 dots, which appear late in history. And he asks whether do you also observe a chronological change from unmarked Berber sounds in earlier manuscripts to the Berber sounds marked with 3 dots in later manuscripts?
شكرا للسائل. نعم، حسب علمي المتواضع، يعني اطلاعي على المخطوطات القديمة والحديثة، أرى أن 3 حروف التي تكون في النطق الأمازيغي يعبر عنها بهذا الشكل. لدي الآن أقدم نموذجا عن هذا النطق، لا أدري إن كان يظهر. عندنا على سبيل المثال حرف الزاي، الزاي المفخم، يعني بمعنى الظاء، ينطق في الأمازيغية هكذا حرف الظاء. إن نقول مثلا الصلاة تظلت، فلا يقولون تزليت كذلك، فيعبرون بهذا الشكل ب3 نقاط. أما بالنسبة لحرف الزاي المرقق فنرى مثلا أنه يكتب كما هو في الحرف العربي بحرف الزاي، لأن النطق في اللغة الأمازيغية بين كلمة مثلا إزري وإزري الاختلاف يكون في تفخيم حرف الزاي، فإذا فخم حرف الزاي يدل على معنى، وإذا رقق يدل على معنى آخر. بالنسبة للمخطوطات حسب ما اطلعنا عليه فإن هذه العادة ما زالت مستمرة إلى حدود إلى وقت متأخر، كنموذج لهذا المخطوط الذي هو حديث نسبيا حوالي 100 سنة تقريبا.
Thank you. Then we have yet another question for Professor Bang. The participant asks, what factors do you think account for the limited number of manuscripts produced in East Africa prior to the 19th century? We have some letters and so on, but why so few manuscripts and Arabic epigraphic texts?
I think the most obvious answer is the environmental degradation. There is just a very extremely few that predates the 19th century indicate at least that there was the tradition of copying in Arabic also before the Busaidi Empire, and also the proximity to South Arabia should indicate the transport or the buying and selling and exchange, if not local copying, existing well prior to the 19th century. So for that reason, I would point to environmental degradation. There would, of course, also be questions regarding competency or skills in terms of producing and copying locally. But even so, you would have expected to find imported manuscripts to a greater extent, which you don't.
Yeah. Okay. So also, as I think, so the paper support is very delicate by being such modern paper. It's even more subject to physical degradation than older manuscripts. So yeah. Thank you. I think Dr. Davila has something to add to the previous answer.
Yes, thank you. I've gone back and looked at the note, the document, and what's happened there is actually the manuscript, the copyist of the manuscript left out a dot, and so what the owner of the manuscript has done has rewritten the word in the margin. The word is not yanjajisu, it's yanbajisu. That is to pour forth, to gush forth. So I think the questioner has misread the marginal note. But what's happened is it's an emendation. He's seen that there's a dot left out. And he's just rewritten the word in the margin.
Okay, thank you. Let's see whether there's any further question.
Well, perhaps, if you permit me, perhaps I have a question.
Sure.
I think to some extent all of our presentations relate to the relationship between, say, a center and a periphery. I mean, we talked about Amazigh texts being translated from Arabic. We talked about Swahili or East African texts being received there in Arabic. Are there any examples of texts in Arabic being created at the periphery and being disseminated via trade routes, via scholarly networks elsewhere? I'd be quite interested to learn more about that.
Professor.
Well, I agree with you that that is a very interesting question, which I think can be answered broadly here in the panel. But certainly, you do see Arabic language titles or texts being created, authored, copied in East Africa, being disseminated onwards within the Swahili region. There are many examples of that. Whether they then would go from the Swahili region onwards, let's say then to South Arabia, for example, or directly across. This is what I would find interesting, from Indonesia to East Africa, or the other way around.
That's what I'm driving at.
Yeah.
I mean, how far do these texts radiate out? I mean,
Yeah.
you can still pick up, for example, Jawi texts in
Absolutely.
Cairo. They were destined for students at Al-Azhar, and they still have an audience here. So there's obviously some kind of connection. I'm just wondering to what extent these connections are universal, or whether that's just an exemption.
You definitely see it in the early print period, because Southeast Asia was earlier with this cheap print material. There you see it quite, I wouldn't say frequently, but you see samples of that in East Africa coming, not going via anywhere in the Middle East, not South Arabia and not Cairo either, for that matter, which indicate that there is a previous pattern of this as well. In manuscript, but yeah, there are certainly examples of manuscripts that have an origin perhaps in Yemen, in Hadramaut, then have a life in Southeast Asia, and then have an onward life in East Africa via trade and family networks. But the authorship would then often be tied to a form of authority that perhaps would more easily facilitate regional onward dissemination rather than across. But I'm guessing here. I would be interested to hear the other panelists.
Yeah.
If I may,
Yeah.
One aspect of this, which is kind of on the periphery of what we've been talking about, is the materials that have been used in these manuscripts. And one of the things I really wanted to ask Professor Bergen has to do with what you might know about the origins of the paper on which many of these manuscripts was copied. I ask because recently a colleague of mine and I have discovered a very interesting connection. I showed you an example of a manuscript that had a dry stamp, a distributor's dry stamp in one corner. It's a paper that was used for a musical manuscript in Morocco. Well, it turns out, according to my colleague André Gour, who works for works in Yemen, that there are papers with the same dry stamp found in archives in Yemen. And so this leads to the question, not only who was producing this paper, but how was this paper circulating? And I can't help wondering if you might have found examples of similar papers that might have originated elsewhere in the Arabic-speaking world there in East Africa.
I'm really very sorry to say that I'm probably not the right person to ask. Maybe some of my colleagues are here in the audience who have worked more directly with this, because my work has been mostly with really 20th century, both manuscript and print, which are then almost always in the same kind of support that you showed on on pre-lined notebooks, right, or these kind of things. There are projects ongoing to delve more seriously into this, and I would certainly not be surprised if you do see exactly the connections that you're indicating, but it is really something that I am in no way an expert to. I haven't studied the paper to be frank. It is being done in a more systematic way, both in the Zanzibar National Archives and in several ongoing projects. So hopefully your question can be answered. I actually find the circulation of the notebooks themselves also quite interesting.
Perhaps
even though they are colonial.
Perhaps this was mainly a plea for help.
Yes, yeah. Well, I just reiterate then the plea for help. Yes.
Good, thank you.
Okay, so I have a call from the organizers. I think we can wrap our session up. So, what to say? My thanks go out to all the presenters and all the participants for the inputs that raised during this session. It was such an interesting and informative session. And of course, my wonderful thanks to the organizers for their efforts and support during this conference. So we are slowly but surely coming to an end of this session, and also the first day of the conference. And I will hand over to Dr. Muehlhaeusler for last word. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا لرئيسة هذه الجلسة ماريا روسو. وإذا سمحت لي قبل أن أنهي هذا اللقاء الممتع الذي استفدنا منه كثيرا حقيقة، أن أتقدم بسؤال إلى أحد المحاضرين في هذه الجلسة، وهو الدكتور وديع. دكتور وديع، هل من الممكن بخصوص المخطوطات الأمازيغية، هل يختلف الحرف العربي جغرافياً بين الأماكن المختلفة التي يستخدم فيها اللغة الأمازيغية؟ يعني هل من الممكن أن نقول إن اللغة الأمازيغية في جنوب المغرب، هل في استخدامها للحرف العربي هل هناك تقاليد تختلف عن تلك التقاليد حينما تستخدم اللغة الأمازيغية في ليبيا مثلا، أو في بعض الواحات، أو في الجزائر؟ هل هناك اختلاف يتعلق باستخدام أو بتقنيات الحرف العربي حينما يستخدم للتعبير عن اللغة الأمازيغية؟
شكرا أستاذ مدحت على هذا السؤال الذي هو حقيقة سؤال مهم. حسب اطلاعي فالتقاليد التي هي حاضرة في المخطوط الأمازيغي السوسي تحديدا حسب مداخلتي مرتبطة بكيفية نطق بعض الحروف. ذكرت أمثلة لحرف الزاي بالتفخيم والترقيق، ذكرت مثالا بحرف الكاف وحرف القاف. أحيانا في بعض المخطوطات قد يوجد حرف القاف على شكل جيم تحتها نقط، 3 نقاط. فحسب اطلاعي هذا هو التقليد الذي المراعى في هذه المنطقة. أظن أن الاختلاف سيكون حتما ما بين اللهجات المختلفة، سواء داخل المغرب مثلا اللسان السوسي الذي هو الشلح ليس هو اللسان الريفي مثلا، وقس على ذلك مقارنة بالأمازيغية في بقية البلدان المغاربة.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور وديع. في نهاية هذه الحلقة من الجلسة الأولى التي استمتعنا فيها بحديث مهم عن التقاليد التاريخية للمخطوطات المكتوبة بالحرف العربي في إفريقيا، أتقدم بشكري الجزيل لرئيسة الجلسة ماريا روسو، وكذلك أشكر أنا كاثرين، وأشكر كارل دافيلا، أشكر مارك مولهاوسلر، أشكر وديع أغونين على كل هذه المشاركات التي أثارت مجموعة مهمة من الأسئلة، والتي من شأنها أن تسد بعض الثغرات التي على أساسها وضعنا تصورا لهذا المؤتمر، لأننا حينما اتفقنا مع شركائنا في هيئة المخطوطات الإسلامية على أن يكون هذا المؤتمر عن المخطوطات بالحرف العربي في إفريقيا، كنا نعي جيدا أن ثمة مشكلات كبيرة تتعلق بهذا الموضوع، سواء كانت هذه المشكلات مرتبطة بصعوبة الوصول إلى هذه المخطوطات في أماكنها داخل إفريقيا، أو صعوبة استكمال كثير من المشروعات التي قامت في إفريقيا في محاولة خدمة هذه المخطوطات التي كتبت بالحرف العربي في كثير من البلدان الإفريقية. كنا نعي جيدا أننا بعد انتهاء هذا المؤتمر ربما نجيب عن كثير من الأسئلة العالقة، والتي قد تكون الإجابة عنها داعما لتحرك أفضل من التحركات السابقة. مرة أخرى شكرا جزيلا لجميع المشاركين في هذه الحلقة، وأدعو جميع المحاضرين وجميع المتابعين إلى متابعتنا غدا بإذن الله تعالى في جلسة جديدة في تمام 1:00 ظهرا بتوقيت شرق أوروبا. شكرا لحسن الإصغاء، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.